Two other categories of land mammals. We have those that have long legs, ones that are easy to tame and ones that are difficult to tame, being a reference to those animals that are easy to tame, the herbivores that we use for agricultural industry, and the ones that are difficult to tame, a reference to the carnivores that we use for household pets. And you see this laid out in more detail in the book of Job, how God created some of these mammals to serve us and others to please us. And it's like, we fare better when we have these relationships with these birds and mammals. And I describe this in some detail in this book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. And I'm going to speak about this in more detail tomorrow morning in my first message. So I'm not going to say any more about that. But there's also a follow-up in this book, Improbable Planet. And that's my latest science book, Improbable Planet, based on a 5-year project. It began with a year where in our church we went through all the creation texts in the Bible and noted every one of them links the doctrine of creation with the doctrine of redemption. And that began a 3-year survey of the scientific literature. Is it really true that everything that God creates is for the purpose of redemption? The answer is yes. Every event in the history of the universe and the earth, and every component of the universe, the earth, and every life form fulfills a role in making possible the redemption of billions of human beings. I understand that there's someone in your church is actually going to lead a study group to go through Improbable Planet. But I encourage you, go through it with redemption in mind. That's the key. Okay, last of all, God creates human beings. And here again, it uses the word bara to create something brand new. What's distinct about us human beings, we're the only species of life that is spiritual. So there are species that are physical, there are species that are physical and soulish, but only we human beings are physical, soulish, and spiritual. Or to put it another way, God created the birds and mammals to form relationships with a higher species. He created us human beings with a capacity to form a relationship with a higher being. I'll speak about this tomorrow, how Job says, look to the birds, they'll teach you. Look to the beasts of the field, they'll instruct you. What he meant is they'll teach you the spiritual lessons you need to be able to develop a relationship with your Creator. That again will be tomorrow morning's first service's theme. And if you want to read more about Adam and Eve, we put out a book called Who Was Adam? But this is what happened to me at age 17. Recognizing that the word day for the creation days is an epoch of time, and the frame of reference is the surface of the earth, I saw that the Bible got a perfect score in describing the initial conditions and a perfect score in describing the events of creation and a perfect score in putting them in the correct chronological order. I mean, just the probability that Moses could have guessed the correct chronological order without God's help is less than 1 chance in 40 billion. The probability he could have correctly described everything is utterly remote. So seeing that at age 17, I said that my only explanation is that the one that actually did all the creation activity inspired Moses to write this down. And explains why every other creation text I read is filled with scientific errors. Well, that's what motivated me to spend an hour or two every day studying the Bible. It took me 18 months to get to Revelation 22, because what I was doing was checking everything it said about science, history, and geography to see if it was true. And I actually wound up creating a notebook about all the places in the Bible where not only was it scientifically accurate, it was predicting scientific discoveries thousands of years ahead of its time. Because I think you must have noticed that this evening. I'm speaking about what's in Genesis 1 that only scientists in the last century have been able to establish is correct. So for thousands of years, the Bible stood alone in making these statements about the history of Earth's life. And now we can prove everything it said indeed is accurate. Well, by the time I got to Revelation 22, I had found over 200 places in the Bible where it made a prediction of a future scientific discovery thousands of years ahead of its time, and in every single case, what it said was accurate. And I calculated the probability that these authors of the Bible could have just guessed all these scientific statements without God's help. The probability was much more remote than 1 chance in 10 to the 300th power. I came up with that number the same time one of my physics professors gave us an assignment to calculate the probability that one of us in our class of 600 would be killed by a sudden reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. You know, that could actually happen right here in this auditorium, because this auditorium is filled with air molecules, but they're not all the same temperature. There's actually a statistical probability that the trillions of air molecules in this room that are below the freezing point of water, 6 seconds from now, will wander in the vicinity of this young lady right here and freeze her to death. That could happen. You know what that probability is? 1 chance in 10 to the 80th. Such a tiny possibility that you'd be justified in never worrying about it for the rest of your life. In fact, you'd be justified in concluding it has never happened anytime, anywhere in the entire observable universe. But notice, I just proved that the Bible was 10 to the 220 times more reliable than the second law of thermodynamics. And here I was, 19 years of age now, realizing I trust my life every second to the reliability of the second law of thermodynamics. It would simply be irrational for me to not put even greater confidence in the message of this book we call the Bible. But I want to give credit to the Gideons. In every one of the Gideon Bibles they hand out in public schools, it includes 2 pages that tell you what you need to do once you become convinced that this indeed is the inspired, inerrant word of the one that created the universe. It begins by making the point that God has written the law on the heart of every human being, the conscience, and that none of us can live up to that conscience. And yet God is so loving and so powerful as He's revealed in His creation, He must have made a way. And that way must be by God Himself. And if we put our confidence in God's offer of redemption, He will save us from all of our offenses against God and others. He'll forgive us. The other thing I appreciate about the Gideons, it made the point that God knows us better than we know ourselves. And He is the only one that is perfectly good and pure. So it only makes rational sense to make Him the boss of your life and take direction from Him. The other thing I appreciate about the Gideons, they don't let you off the hook. They got a place right there for you to sign your name and date your name, committing your life to Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. And I did that on August 6th at 1:05 in the morning back in 1964.